All right, so our next panelist discussion, straight from New York City and Cornell Tech, who we partner with on a whole bunch of things and hopefully more in the future. I'll simply say it's Fernando, one of my main contacts at Cornell Tech, and Neel, a former Runway
Alumni.
Alumni.
Yes, alumni.
And we're going to have a discussion between those two. Enjoy. Take it away.
Thank you so much. I was going to say portfolio company. That sounds even better.
That sounds better.
There we go.
Okay,
Because it's true, we do have an equity investment in this company. So good morning, everyone. It's great to see you here. My name is Fernando Gómez-Baquero. I'm the director of Runway and Spinouts at the Jacobs Technion-Cornell Institute at Cornell Tech. Whew, it's a lot of words right there. But basically, I manage the incubation acceleration programs at Cornell Tech. And one of our main programs is our Runway Startup Postdoc program, which has been a wonderful, wonderful program in which we take very young, eager entrepreneurs. Any PhD students here in the room? No, they're all out there eating and drinking? Okay, maybe a little bit later on,
yeah.
Right? But we take wonderful young PhDs that just graduated from their PhD, and we bring them to Cornell Tech and give them the opportunity to be entrepreneurs as a postdoctoral appointment. So basically, I was going to wear this, but too many layers for a beautiful sunny day, right? So this is our program, the Runway Startup program. And if you have a PhD and a good startup idea, then we're going to be your first investors, right? So maybe you'll see me with this at some point in time. And so in this conversation, I'm very excited about having this conversation because I've known Neel for a long time. When I started working at Cornell Tech, Neel had just started his journey of entrepreneurship. He's always, when I think of someone that has lived Cornell, kind of like bled, read, and seen all of the Cornell glory. Neel is one of those persons, but he's also held up Cornell's name very high up with what he's doing. And we're going to merge that with a great conversation on AI, which is very topical right now, very important. We heard about it a little bit yesterday as well. So better than me trying to explain who Neel is, I'm going to let you, Neel, introduce yourself and talk a little bit more about you yourself, OneThree Biotech.
Cool. Hey, everyone. It is a little bit surreal being back in Ithaca after being so long, but I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am Neel Madhukar. I am the CEO, one of the co-founders of OneThree Biotech. I'll tell you what OneThree does in a second. But pre-OneThree, I actually got my PhD at Cornell. I got it at Weill, so I spent 3 years of my PhD at Weill, 1 year in Ithaca. Then couldn't get enough of Cornell, so then went over to the Runway program for a couple of years, where OneThree was really incubated and spun out. And I would say, OneThree was built off of the original research that we did at Cornell and Weill, which the fundamental idea was early in 2013. For those of you who don't know, Weill Cornell, the medical campus in New York, was opening, at that time, the US's very first precision medicine center, right? So based on this hypothesis that if we can be smarter about data, AI, any sort of computation, with all of the biological data out there, we can make better patient decisions. And what I was really interested in is I had, just a few years prior, lost a very close family member to a rare form of cancer. A cancer that had no treatment. And so what I was interested in was how can we use some of this data, some of these new technologies that are emerging in the AI space to design and discover treatments in a way that previously hadn't been possible. So I spent a couple years working on that within the Cornell ecosystem. Looked like it was working, and decided then to spin out OneThree Biotech on that kind of initial idea. So at OneThree, we are, in the simplest terms, a AI-driven cancer discovery company. If you think about the way a cancer treatment is normally discovered, it's some professor, some of these like right across the street, spend 10 years in a lab doing research on specific genes, specific pathways. Eventually, they find out that, hey, maybe there's a link between this gene or this pathway and some type of cancer. Then do more experiments, a pharma company steps in, tries to make a drug out of it. That 10-year process is an incredibly inefficient way to do it. And what we are trying to do is, can we do this in a scalable fashion? Can we use AI to discover 10 new ways to treat rare cancers in the time it would have taken us to discover one? So built off this platform, kind of starting with at the Runway postdoc and since then afterwards. Now we're kind of in an interesting space. We in the last year have decided to invest more internally and actually are now running and trying to develop our own drugs. So we now have 3 programs, one in lung cancer, one in ovarian cancer, and one in melanoma. So super excited about that. And yeah, just really excited to chat about the journey from Cornell to Cornell to OneThree and how AI and bio are kind of shifting in today's ecosystem.
Yeah, and I wanted to start a little bit with, you mentioned when I came to Cornell, we were trying to figure out how to do this, and the field has evolved a lot, right? And right now it would seem obvious that you need to use AI, machine learning, but tell us a little bit, when you started at Weill, what was kind of the view of using computational tools? How early was that, and have you seen kind of everything change over the past? It hasn't been that long. It's been 5 years.
Yeah, but I will say, so when we started in 2013, the view on computation in biology was, why do we need this? Right? I cannot tell you how many times I went into a room with an oncologist, cell biologist, and myself. And I was like, oh, here's what the data says. And they're like, I don't need the data. I've been an oncologist for 15 years. I know this pathway. And it's like, okay, cool. And that persisted for quite a while. Like even early days of OneThree, we would meet some of the largest pharma companies with some of the largest budgets in the world. And we'd come in and say, we think we have an interesting way of looking at this problem. And their first response is, well, we've been doing it this way for a bit. There's too many people involved. It's a challenging situation. And in the startup world, there's been a lot of companies, I'd say, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, that have come up using AI in the biology, that's their moniker, for lack of a better word, right? Some of the big ones, for those familiar, you have the Recursions, Pharmas of the world, which is probably the biggest benevolent AIs. So they came out, right? There was this kind of huge swell of excitement and interest for AI and bio, 2018, around that time. And I would say it's interesting, right? Because we had this huge swell of info. There was a pretty sharp dip in 2020, right? And we can talk more about that. And now you're seeing it kind of level out. So, I suppose you might have seen there's always this curve of hype, it falls, and then there's some middle ground. And it's been interesting, right? We were pre-hyped and we saw the hype train, and we were post-hype, and now I feel like we're hitting this kind of happy medium of where it can actually be applied. I don't know if that fully answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So it's kind of that, I love it that you talked about the cycle, because a lot of entrepreneurs that are here in the room, maybe you are at that point in time when they're in your topic, it's hype, and it's wonderful, and everybody's looking at it. But maybe in a few years, it won't be. And now you're going to be maybe disappointed, or you're going to say, oh, it's more difficult to raise money.
Yeah.
But the reality is that this is a normal part of entrepreneurship. You start maybe pre-hype or at hype, then it shifts, and then it comes back to reality.
Yeah. And I would say hype, during when it's in that hype, right? So for instance, if anyone in this room is working on large language models or anything in that world, right? I would say that hype cycle is actually the most dangerous time for a startup, right? Because it's very easy, and we're guilty of this too, right? When it was happening, money was flowing, right? Investors were like, cool, AI and bio, take some money. Pharma companies were like, we'll happily take any meeting you want. And then when it fell, right, there were a lot of companies out there in this space, a lot of CEOs I know who raised large amounts of money in that hype cycle, and now they're really struggling because it's translating to what are the actual outcomes, right? I think that, in my mind, I feel is one of the most dangerous times for a startup, because it's very easy to get caught up in that hype and think it's going to last forever. And then a year, 2 years, however many years later, when people are like, well, we're kind of done with that, on to the next thing, and you have to convert that to some sort of tangible results, whatever that result is. I feel just personally, the AI and bio market has thinned heavily in the last 2 to 3 years. Whether that's good or bad, it depends on who you ask, but it has thinned pretty heavily.
Yeah. Let's go a little bit back to when you were at Weill, and you were working there with Olivier Mento in the lab. Tell us a little bit the process of you saying, okay, I think there's something here that is unique, is novel, is different, and maybe this is something that we can take out and make into a company. How did that happen?
Yeah, no, I wish I had a better story for you. Everyone always asks the moment you knew, and there was no moment we knew. So the real story is, we're working on this technology. If there's any professors or professor adjacents in the room, you know, a big part of any sort of academic work is applying for grants, right? Like we wanted to get a grant to fund an additional couple years of work. And there was a line on the grant, like how do you think if your work is successful, it can affect the ecosystem, the whatever, like the world. And purely as a throwaway line, we wrote, if this works, we could maybe spin out a company on it. That company could be a new pharma company. Did not think for a second about it, wrote it in the grant, submitted the grant. You know, how many months later, we got the grant, and someone in development like, oh yeah, there's an interesting need for a company like this in the ecosystem. And then at that point, we may be like, really? Like, what do I know about running a company, right? I never envisioned myself as a startup person, never thought I'd be a CEO. I thought I'd be a doctor for the longest time, though I didn't want to be a doctor. I thought I'd be a professor. Now here I am doing none of that. So yeah, but then I think what ended up happening is, you know, one of the things I loved about Weill Cornell in general was like you had the opportunity to break out of the academic bubble, right? Like year 2 of my PhD, I was working with a few different pharma companies. I was working with a few different institutes. And I got to see kind of firsthand how the technology we were building was being used, right? We were working, year 2 of my PhD, or year 3, we started working with Pfizer, right? Pfizer has a budget so much bigger than anything the lab, even the entire department that Cornell could think about. And we could see them being like, hey, like, we want to apply this. Like, the scientists were getting engaged. Like, things were happening in a way that they weren't previously. So I think that was kind of the first market validation, for lack of a better word. Like, hey, like, these people who have hundreds of more scientists, they have billions of dollars, are interested in what we're building. So I think at that point, we're like, okay, there might be something here. You know, the idea of, is it new? It's always kind of hard, right? I think like in bio, ideas are a dime a dozen. And I think Fernando actually drilled this into us early days in Runway. It's like, how are you going to execute on it, right? So it's like, there's tons of people out there who are like, I have a new way to discover cancer drugs, and some of them may be different, better, worse, who knows, on what we're building at OneThree. But I think what was interesting was thinking about like, what sort of new sort of company do we want to build, right? Like, what does a cancer drug discovery company look like now versus the standard? And I think we only learned that probably much later. Like, once we were in Runway, we had to kind of escape our own love of the technology and start look at what are companies out there doing, what do we want to do that's a little bit different. But the frank answer is we didn't know until we saw people who had more experience in the space being interested. And then we didn't really know what type of company, why it was new, until we spent a bunch of time learning about every other company.
Yeah. So let's give a little love to the technology side of things, because I definitely want you to talk about computation, right? And the role of computation right now in biology. Why is it so important? It obviously seems obvious right now. You've been working on it before, it was hyped. But why is it that computation can really address a lot of the challenges that we have?
Yeah. So I'll answer this first by taking a step back and looking at the problem, right? 30, 40 years ago, cancer was one disease, right? Whatever. 10 years ago, it's 10, 20 diseases. Now it's maybe 100 diseases. I fundamentally believe if we have this conversation 10 years from now, cancer will be 1,000, if not more, individual diseases, right? That's both good and bad, right? Good in the sense that we're being more granular. Bad in the sense, these are now 1,000 different diseases. We don't have 1,000 different treatments, right? And at the rate we're going, we're not going to. And people can argue, yeah, there's one treatment that could be used for multiple cancers, and that might be the case. But ultimately, for really meet the goals of precision medicine, you have to we have to massively increase this rate of new treatment creation. So that's one problem. The other is thinking about data, right? The amount of healthcare data increases by an order of magnitude of like 10 to 20x almost every couple of years in the terms of new genetics are coming out, new data types are coming out, right? If for anyone in this room to get their genome sequenced, right, that's a proposition that can be done in $50, really, right? 10 years ago, it was nowhere close to $50. 23andMe, you can get it done in your own home. And then on top of that, there's been new technologies, right? Robotics has made it so much easier to generate data sets on 1 million drugs in a month. All of that being said, right? So now you're going from small data sets of 10 years ago to large millions and millions of data points that have to be thrown in. So for instance, I'll say the OneThree database, right, a database that we've built on our back end, we just hit our 100th billionth data row, right? Which is crazy to even, like, even if you had told me that in 2013, I'd be like, that's ludicrous, right? Like, we were working on the order of like thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Now, no one's gonna go through 100 billion rows. So on one end, you need computation because there's so much data out there. You have to have some sort of high compute way to like look at it. The other thing is, you know, for better or for worse, every scientist, every doctor, every researcher is biased. Maybe not intentionally so, but biased by their knowledge. And what I mean by that is the way PhDs and researchers work is you spend 10, 20, 30 years studying a very, very specific field of biology. You're going to be biased inherently by the fact that like your knowledge is going to lead you to that field. Like you're going to try and like look at that field. That's going to be your focal point. So that's why if you look at cancer drugs, even if there's 100 cancer drugs, they really only fall into a couple of classes, and those are the classes that just tend to be more well-studied, that tend to be the more well-studied cancers. So you kind of need to think about like, it's super hard to break through that in like a traditional human research setting. This is an area where computation could be a little bit more effective, right? Because you can inherently weight things differently. You can inherently look for areas that haven't been looked at. You can try and break free of biases. And this is not to say, I think there's a whole different conversation to be had about the biases of AI, but I kind of view AI as both very biased and very unbiased, depending on how you look at it. So I think things like that, you know, the problem is exploding, so we have to think of new ways to do it. The emergence of data types and new AI methods have allowed us to address the problem in ways that previously haven't been possible. And I think it's also, you know, this is a little more on the market side, I think it's becoming, AI is becoming more easy to access, right? You know, for instance, I'm reluctant to bring it up this early in the conversation, but things like ChatGPT, right? You can see AI.
It was going to come up, so
I'm
no
sure
worries.
it will.
Yeah, exactly.
But it has made like things much easier to access, right? So it presents an interesting question of like how that's going to evolve for AI-driven companies. But I think it makes this a problem we have to look at now, and it's a good time to look at it.
That's a good segue. There was a comment yesterday. One of our companies that presented said, well, the problem with ChatGPT for them that they're doing summarization is ChatGPT is too chatty, right? So it gives too much,
Yeah.
And is not really suited for what they want to do. So when you're thinking about, let's say, applying AI and all these models that are coming, so you know, how important it is for you to say, okay, we need to develop something that is very unique, very specific, as opposed to just saying, hey, let's take a look at what's out there and try to apply it?
It's an interesting question. So I was actually on a panel like 2-3 weeks ago, and I was maybe the least favorite panelist on that panel because I was not the biggest ChatGPT fan in the world. We'll talk about that in just a second. But you know, I think one way you have to look at it is we do not have an AI that's 100% accurate, right? We probably will never have an AI that's 100% accurate. I think the first way you have to look at is like, what is the cost of being wrong, right? If you are booking, I used to give this example all the time, right? If you're like a picture company, it's like, is this a picture of a cat or not a picture of a cat? If you mess that up, is it really the biggest deal in the world, right? So someone like sends a picture of a watermelon and says it's a picture of a cat. Okay, like maybe you lose a user. In bio, in medicine, right, and there's different ways, but like let's just look at life sciences, bio, which is kind of our focus on. A wrong AI prediction is going to be minimum hundreds of thousands of experimental costs wasted. Maximum, like you could put a wrong drug in a clinical trial, hurt people, cost hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So I think the cost of failure or the thing of it is going to push companies to decide, like, are we going to build more? Are we going to be better, right? Like, and I think that's the area you have to ask. Like, when you think of like, is 80% accuracy good enough, or do you need to build an entirely new system to get to that 90-95? For us, that 90-95 is incredibly important, right? So that's one area. And the second, like a lot of these models that are out there, right? I kind of view them as, how do I put it? Let me put it this way. ChatGPT is not, the newest thing about ChatGPT, in my opinion, is the universal usage, right? Like the engineering they've built to let people use it at scale. The models itself, people have been using those for years, right? Like we were working on similar large language models at Cornell in 2017, right? I think what OpenAI has done really well is allowed it for anyone to use it instead of kind of restricting it behind academic walls. So I think the question then is like, what are you trying to do? Is the problem you're trying to do, like you need something done so quickly, so fast, and like there's probably tools you can use out there that will save you a lot of time. If it's, for lack of a word, like low expertise, high throughput tasks, if I'm in your shoes, I would use some of the tools that are out there. I don't think you need to necessarily build it out. If it's very low end, very high expertise, very high cost of failure, I think that's where you're going to see companies innovating on those AI edges and like trying to build in-house or different models.
Yeah, and that's a great point because a lot of these companies, OpenAI, Cohere, Hugging Face, are really lacking those type of expert products, right? So there are normal products, but the expert product, it's a completely different ballgame.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah.
When you, so I wanted to talk a little bit, you are right now focused on moonshot. You're saying there's a couple of cancers, that I want to tackle, but you didn't start that way with a moonshot, right?
Yeah.
You start with something a little bit simpler. So what did you start with and how was that transition towards moonshot?
Yeah, that transition was very difficult. Let me just put it this way. So we started off, like a little bit in love with the idea, in the sense of what I mean is like we thought we had really cool technology, right? I was fresh out of my PhD. I was like a 25-year-old who's like, I built some cool tech. It's gonna change the world. Give me a bunch of money.
And he did get a bunch of money. So.
But like we started off basically saying like we have tech. Pharma knows how to build drugs. SaaS companies were all the rage. Let's be a SaaS company, right? We'll go in, we'll sell this tech to pharma. They'll do it. And for anyone who's tried to sell into pharma, I'm sure anyone who's done that is now like rolling their eyes a little. And I wish I was back then. And if anyone tells me that's now, I'll roll my eyes at them. But we started to see the sales process was difficult, right? We started to understand that there were so many moving parts to developing a drug that we didn't know, that we would have never known in kind of, lack of a better word, our academic bubble, right? Like we had just seen the science of it. We hadn't seen all the different moving pieces that go into a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry. So when we started off, we started selling the services. We started, we got a few initial hits, made initial cash, got our initial validations. Actually even used some of that to raise our additional round of funding out after Cornell. But then started to see that the process was two things. One, it was giving us validation, it was giving us capital. We were doing objectively well, but we weren't capturing the value we wanted to capture. And I won't go too deep into the biotech industry, but it's an industry that's so driven by low probability successes, right? Like pharma companies assume if they test 100 drugs, 99 will fail, but the one will succeed is going to be worth billions of dollars. It's almost like a venture capital model, right? Like venture capitalists assume they invest in 10 companies, 9 will fail, but one might be a billion-dollar company and they'll make their funds back on that. So what that means is if you're playing in that game, the way to get value is to capture on those successes. And as I said, the way OneThree's platform really works is our goal is we want to reduce that failure rate. But what we found over and over is that we were finding drugs that looked like they were moving forward with pharma companies, but we were getting SaaS-like revenues on small number of deals, whereas if it was successful, the pharma company would get a lot out of it. And it's almost like, I hate to kind of blame VCs, but I will in this moment, right? Like VCs inherently push companies towards high risk, high reward opportunities. So there was an interesting point, I'd say about a couple years ago, where we were like, what we think is really exciting, where we can capture the most value is by owning these ourselves, right? If we owned a piece of this drug, if we owned this drug, or we invested a little bit more into ourselves, we could capture more value from it. And that was an interesting shift, not only in terms of the type of company we wanted to be, but in terms of how we were selling. It was an interesting board meeting when I went to our board and I was like, hey guys, remember this revenue graph I've been showing you? I'm going to stop showing you that because revenue is no longer going to be our short-term indicator of success. And all of our investors were like, what are you talking about, Neel? Yeah, exactly. Who we were going to hire, the type of company we want to build, the type of investors we want to build, right? And like But I feel like it's a shift that had to happen, and we're very happy it happened. And the second thing, for any potential future current entrepreneurs in the room, I think a big question is also, what is the type of company you wanted to build, right? Like, even if a SaaS company could be successful, I think I had to reckon with the idea that I did not want to be a SaaS CEO, right? Like, it was just not my personal passion, right? Like, I wanted to I started this company because, like I said, I lost a very close family member to cancer. I wanted to kind of be more involved in the process. I wanted my employees to kind of have a say. I didn't, we wanted people who were so energized in like the one drug they're working on and thinking about those end goals, and that was the culture we wanted to build. So I would say once we made that pivot, not only did we think like the economics, the story, the invest, like those became, I wouldn't say easier, but they became clearer, but we also found like company culture have changed pretty dramatically in a way that me and my co-founder were incredibly excited about. So yeah, I don't know if that really answered your question, but yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's a great thought process on how do you start with an idea, go through the motion of finding the market, finding the fit, and then after many iterations and a little bit more of the experience, you say, you know what? I am going to build a company that I want to build, solving the problem that I want to solve. And it takes a while for the young entrepreneurs that are in the audience. It doesn't happen automatically. It took a few years.
Yeah. Because I think, I will also say, like, my piece of advice is like, and one of my investors said this, is like, you never make money in venture capital without taking the contrarian opinion. That's also true for startups, right? Like, this idea of like, we wanted to go after those moonshots. Like, there were a lot of supporters, right? I remember even Fernando early days, he was like, that's a huge opportunity. One day maybe you guys can get there. But like, there were also a lot of people who were like, what do you know about doing this, right? Like, OneThree is my first real job, right? So like, what do you know about running a company that's gonna go into clinical trials? Like, you guys are small, like, how are you gonna compete with the big pharmas, right? So I think at a certain point, right, like, my take is, you also have to take, like, you have to be willing to take that contrarian opinion. Hopefully you should test it and you should have ways to make sure it's right as you go forward. But as a startup, you like have to be willing to do that, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense in the moment.
Let's talk a little bit about how do you think, I hear a lot, oh, I want to do bio, I want to do AI, go to Boston. Go to North Carolina, use a triangle. That's even not as much anymore, but it used to be the case, go to Silicon Valley and build it there. Why do you think now, or how have you seen that change in New York, and why is New York, and New York, I'm not just talking about New York City, New York State in general, why is it a good place to do bio and pharma?
Yeah, so we got that, people told us that at the beginning as well, right? Go to Boston or go to SF. So for anyone who knows me very well, I am not the biggest Silicon Valley fan for bio. And what I mean by that is I kind of view Boston and Silicon Valley, and I'm going to use these as extremes, then talk about New York in a second, in my mind represent the two different worldviews of biotech, right? Boston is the old behemoth in the room, right? Like, all the pharma companies are there, all the classic old school bio companies are based there, right? You have, one of our advisors is C-suite is a Boston Biotech, and he told me he has worked 12 jobs in the last 30 years. All of those jobs have been within the one block of each other, right? That's the way Boston is, right? We went to dinner and he's like, oh, that was my old CSO, I fired that person, they work for me right now, that table, and like, that's the way it is, right? Like, it is a very small, tight-knit community that's run by a lot of old school bio, right? And I think some of the best traditional biotech happens there. Silicon Valley, right, like, a bunch of VCs made a bunch of money in the early 2010s, and we're like, we're gonna pour it into bio companies. And I have gone on many a pulpit and said, I think the worst thing that has happened to AI in bio is companies coming out saying AI is going to fix drug discovery. It's not going to. Drug discovery is, honestly, I think one of the most challenging problems we face as a society. AI, while an incredibly powerful tool, is not going to magically fix it. But you had many companies come out there and say stuff like that. And I won't name names, but there was one company, which is now a public billion-dollar-plus company, that said very, very publicly when they started, we are going to have 100 new drugs in the clinic by 2025. Best case scenario, they might have 2 drugs in the clinic by 2025, right? That is still an amazing outcome 2 drugs in the clinic in 10 years from my early, or 7 years when they started, is an amazing outcome for this company. But like that vernacular, I think that's what I think led to that hype and then led to the crash when people started to realize like they're 98% off of their goal. So, but Silicon Valley had like that, we're gonna disrupt, we're gonna do everything AI. I kind of view New York, right, the city and the state, as like a nice hybrid of those two, right? Because you had the great academic research institutions, right? Cornell here, but in New York City, Cornell, Weill, NYU, Mount Sinai, right, who are producing amazing biotech research at the quality of the MITs, the Harvards, the Stanfords. You had capital coming in, right? New York and New York State has capital. It hasn't traditionally been bio capital, but it's been finance or tech capital, so there's opportunities to do that. And you have so many people who want to work, for lack of a better word, and my apologies to anyone who's, you know, a fintech in the room or finance in the room, but, you know, things that they're like, we have a lot of people who used to work in finance, like, I want to work on something that feels a little bit more meaningful to me or more personal, right? So you have an amazing talent pool. And New York State brings people from all around the world into it. So like, I kind of view it as that amazing hybrid between the two, right? Where you had the good science and you had the people who are willing to think outside the box. And even when you look at like the pharma companies that open New York City offices, they're opening offices specifically to like, I don't want to say disrupt, but like think of new ideas, which was exactly what I learned. Like we came from an academic background. We always wanted OneThree to be thought of as the company with the best science, but we were pioneering things in a new way. So I always loved New York for that. Of course, now the world is changing, and I will say we have employees all over the country. We still are home based in New York, and I think we're going to see more of that. But I kind of love New York as this kind of hybrid new, I don't want to say bio, I don't want to say tech, but like this hybrid, truly biotech ecosystem.
And for all of those in the audience and the students, if you want to get into this field, know that for the past couple of years, New York has had the largest venture capital investment in digital life sciences. It became the #1 in digital life sciences. And New York City, through the Economic Development Corporation, wants to become #1 in life sciences in general.
Yep.
Lots of support going there. I'm just going to make a little parenthesis here, start thinking about questions for Neel, because he's here, so you definitely need to use this time to ask him questions. But I do want to ask you, you're working on those moonshots, and you're picking very interesting cancer targets, right? Cervical, very complicated.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about why you selected those challenges, which are really, really big?
Yeah.
And then my next question, but I'll do it later on, is what are some low-hanging fruit that you can do with AI? But let's start with the big ones. So why those?
Yeah, so the honest answer is it's a little bit of a business reason, right? Let's assume the science, like let's assume that you feel like your science is good on those high-value cancers, which I think is a prerequisite. The other is you're now competing, no matter how you look at it, with every big pharma company out there, right? Like I'm not going to compete with Johnson & Johnson on lung cancer, right? Like just general lung cancer. It's too hard a field. They will outspend, they will outscience, they will know more about it. Focusing on these rare, hard-to-treat cancers that, one, there's a huge unmet need, and two, aren't getting as much attention from the bigger players because they're complicated, is inherently, to me, the idea of a moonshot. It's harder, it might not work, but if we're able to prove success in it, we will be one of the first, if not one of the only players there, right? And this has been shown, like for those familiar with bio, right? Loxo Oncology, company that was sold to Eli Lilly for like $8 billion, was the first pioneer in the field. Like we're gonna pick an incredibly hard-to-treat cancer. If we figure it out, we will basically own that market, right? So that's the way we look at it. Is, you know, for instance, one of our programs is in a rare type of small cell lung cancer. There's not that many people focusing on that type of cancer, right? So if we can prove results in it, not only is there a patient population that needs help, and I'm not gonna go into like the whole how drugs are priced and that's a whole different conversation, but there's a patient population that needs help, so a clearly defined market. If we can show success in it, there will be interest from pharma, and it's where, as a small startup, we can outcompete the bigger players. So I think that's an area where it's just, you know, on the business side, it makes sense, but also too, it's like, it excites us, right? Like, you know, one of the things we have is, I always love to tell the story, like, you know, one of the ways I think when we were like, we onto something is, we a couple years ago got the chance to meet some children who were treated as part of a brain cancer trial we did a couple years ago, right? 13-year-old children who were given 6 months to live. they're now 2.5 years later still doing well on a treatment that came out of the OneThree platform, right? I think that's what gives you, like, energizes you, right? Like, we're not doing this, not to say like, I'm not in this business to add an additional 3 months or 6 months to patients. I think while incredibly valuable, like, we're going to go after those cancers where like those patients have no other options, and like we want to be them to go forward, right? Regardless of how well the business does, regardless of what we do, I will be thrilled if 10, 20 years from now, me and our employees and our investors can look at rare cancers and patients that wouldn't have otherwise had an opportunity and say like, we gave them that opportunity.
And let's go to the very more like low-hanging fruit, right?
Yeah.
So what are some things that you think can be done there that maybe some of these entrepreneurs could take on?
So I'll speak a little bit outside of this, the biospace as the general digital health. I'll start off with digital health, right? Like, for anyone who's been to a doctor's office or has worked at a doctor, there's a lot of inefficiencies in just how processes are run that could be made more efficient. Those are areas where you could come in, you could use maybe a pre-built AI tool, make things slightly more efficient, right? And that could be great businesses, right? When one of our investors have invested in a medical billing company, I will say one of the least sexy company descriptions I've ever heard, but an incredibly successful company, right? So those are areas where it's a well-defined problem, it's heavily repeatable, medical billing, you see a lot of it being done even in things like pathology, which is a difficult problem, but the data looks the same, right? You can focus on specific areas. In the biotech space, you see a lot being done on the chemistry side of the equation, which is clearly defined processes. I think the challenge you're going to have there is it's low-hanging fruit on on the operation scientific side, but because it's low-hanging fruit, there's a lot of people there, right? So you're going to have to compete with different people. So I think there's a lot. I think digital health, because of these new AI tools, is becoming much more approachable, and you're seeing a lot more people get in there. So that's where I'd focus.
Wonderful. And I want to give a shout out to Truffle Health, which is one of our portfolio companies that is doing medical billing.
Perfect.
Because
They're
it's a
probably doing very well, yeah.
great opportunity. So another Cornell startup doing that. So I'm going to open it up for questions. If anyone in the audience wants to pick Neel's brain, this is the time before he becomes too important and travels all over the world.
The Elisa over there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really hard question. I'll maybe say two things. One is the FDA has been very active about trying to integrate new, being open about its writing about new AI tools, right? So I think there's an interest, at least at the medical regulatory level, about saying we want to think about new AI. The challenge with the way it would work is, for anyone who knows, but like one of the key tenets of AI is it's constantly learning, retraining. So the underlying algorithm is constantly changing. That is a no-no for most FDA regulations, right? Like they want something static. They can be like, we have approved this. So the learning process makes it very, very difficult. I don't know what the solution to that is, right? Because I think by taking that out, you're heavily hamstringing where the AI can come in. Where I think, like I said, I'm going to go back to my ChatGPT example for a second, right? I think if you think about like, what is AI doing? Is it AI-assisted decision-making, which I think the FDA has done a lot in that. I think that's where you're going to see the most regulatory advances come in, right? Pathology or medical decision-making, where the AI is not the final decision-making, or you're not making actions based on the AI. It's feeding into a doctor, a physician, et cetera, right? So for instance, one of the things when ChatGPT was out, like we were playing with it, right? And like using it for both medical and non-medical reasons. And the idea of like, it was very helpful when someone was there on the tail end to be like, hey, I can edit this and change it, right? And I already know some physicians who, even though it's not approved, are using ChatGPT to help in their decision-making process. So I think you're going to see the biggest regulatory advancements come in like assisted decision-making rather than pure AI. I honestly cannot say do I think in the next 5-10 years we're going to see a fully AI-powered drug discovery process? No, I don't think the FDA is moving at that pace. So if I'm looking at this, I'm thinking about short term, how can you use AI to assist decision making to get to a place where you can fit into the FDA's or any sort of regulatory agency's clearly defined guidelines, which is perhaps a sad but practical answer.
Okay, we have time for one more. Anybody? Yeah. Hold on one second. Let me get you the mic so folks online can hear.
A great presentation. Really appreciate your insights. So I have a thought. As you talk about rare cancers, I was at the rare disease, so FDA every year has a rare disease day, and I was there pre-COVID, the day that Stephen Hahn had come on, and he talked as an oncologist about many cancers are rare diseases.
Yeah.
But I want to now pull you back away from cancer as a rare disease to rare diseases and the 7,000 rare diseases that have no treatments. Do you see an application for what you've done so far in the rare disease cancer space to rare diseases more broadly, many of which are genetic in origin?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the short answer is yes. I think rare diseases, and for anyone who didn't hear, right, his question was, how can you apply AI that's currently being used in cancer to the more rare disease space in general? I think you can see it being used, like the technology is applicable. For instance, we have a partnership outside of just oncology and infectious diseases and respiratory syncytial virus, right? We recently had a partnership that. We had another partnership in the endometriosis space. So it's outside of cancer. The reason I would say you see a lot of companies focus on cancer is twofold. One, there's a lot of cancer data out there, which makes AI a little bit easier. I think, to be honest, I don't think that's the biggest problem anymore. There's a ton of rare disease data out there right now. So if you're starting an AI company right now in the biospace, rare diseases, genetic diseases are completely applicable. The other, I'd say, more practical answer is, as an AI company, right, if you're trying to identify a new treatment, you are still going to face investors, pharma, et cetera, being like, prove it works. It is very easy to prove something works early stages on cancer. What I mean by that is when you're trying to do cancer, you are trying to kill a cancer cell. So it's easy to run that experiment, easy in the sense of like it only costs $100,000 instead of $1 million to take a cancer cell, give it a drug, see if the cell lives or dies. One of the hardest things, I know this is not a rare disease, I'm going to use Alzheimer's as an example. The hardest thing is there's no easy way to test if something works on Alzheimer's until you give it to maybe a mouse, but more likely a patient, right? We don't have a good readout. So a lot of rare diseases that are genetic in nature, right? It's not a single cell, it's a body-wide effect. And what that means is you have to create a cheap, easy to test model of the body for whatever you're coming out of it. So I think what you're going to see realistically is I think in the next 5 to 10 years, fingers crossed, you're going to see a lot of headway into cancer coming from AI-powered approaches. That's going to hopefully cause an attitude shift in the market, in the pharma and VC space saying, we believe this can work. And then you're going to have people being more willing to say, I'm willing to invest $1 million to test an AI-driven prediction. Right now, any pharma company is not going to do that. They might invest 50 to 100 because there's still this skepticism around it. So I think that's what you're going to see. I would love, like we have rare disease predictions come out all the time, and I would, if we had $500 million in the bank, we would be going after them, but sadly, no one has given us that. So when Cornell raises its next fund, let us know.
There we go.
Yeah, but that's the way to think about it. That's how we think about it, at least.
We're proud investors and we're reinvesting.
Yeah.
So just to end, Zach, I'll obviously thank Neel, but I'll give you an anecdote too. I think the last time that we were both here in the Stadler, in this room, you were holding a check, right? That you just won, was it Ben Daniel?
It was
you
Ben
won?
Daniel, yeah.
So he had just won Ben Daniel, so this is, it's amazing, it's surreal to see now the progress of this, but I also want to motivate everybody that is here because you can be here and win Ben Daniel with this check, that feels very meaningful. And then just a few years later, you can be an absolute monster leader in your field, developing amazing things. So with that being said, thank you so much, Neel.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you to you both. That was fantastic.